Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel. Design elements of contemporary strategy games and contemporary perspectives in game design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http 3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 14. What makes a good game? Always wonderful to note, I'm not going to do the whole thing from the beginning, but since the camera had dead time. However, very briefly, we talked about things that aren't a game. Toys like American plastic bricks aren't games. Stories like role-playing events in which the games master, even the script immunities have script immunities, are not games. Killer dungeons really aren't games very much. Things with no participation, 70,000 people watching two football coaches telling their 300-pound players what to do, those are not games for almost anyone except a few people. And I was about to say that puzzles are not games. This is Greg Kostikian's idea. But the idea that puzzles are not games is much more dangerous than it sounds. A good example is chess. Another potential example, though it actually isn't that way, is Go. Why is chess a puzzle or a game? Well, most people would say it's a game, yes. However, if you look at the chess rules, you discover that you must, within 50 moves, either take a piece or shove a pawn, and therefore the game of chess, or the game is a draw, and therefore there is a longest possible game of chess, and it isn't actually that long, it's a few thousand moves. Furthermore, at any given position, the number of possible moves that there can be is fairly limited. I don't know if someone has computed the maximum, but if you actually try to set things up so every piece has as many moves as possible, we're talking a possible number of moves in the hundreds. The number of states of the game, the number of possible chess positions is quite finite. It's rather large combinatorically, but it's finite. You can make it a little larger because a chess position may or may not have been repeated. If you repeat the same position 3 times, the game is a draw. So there's a little element there that's not just what the pieces are on the board, and therefore, in a fundamental sense, chess is a puzzle because it's a finite state object, everything is defined, and therefore, if you play everything out, there are only a certain number of things that can happen, and they're all determined in advance. Having said chess is a puzzle, is it a solved puzzle? No. As opposed to checkers, which is a solved puzzle. Checkers has been mathematically solved in the same sense that tic-tac-toe has been solved. There's a perfect strategy. For chess, though, we don't know whether the outcome is this is a draw, or white has a guaranteed win, or perhaps photograph of the opening chessboard, and the nice German title is Weiß auf Zugzwang, which means no matter what white does, it's going to lose. We don't know the outcome. But in a certain sense, if you have a certain finite number of states and a finite number of positions, it's a puzzle. People will correctly note that the number of possible chess games, by reasonable estimate, is vastly larger than the number of atoms in the universe, and therefore attempting to solve chess computationally by exhaustion, which is basically what was done to checkers, is not going to be computationally possible. Unless, of course, it's white to move and lose in 9 forced win, because the win trees are much shorter than anyone thought possible. The alternative to that, of course, if it's a puzzle, if it's a finite state automaton like life, gee, maybe there's a way to do theorem proving on it, and instead of doing exhaustion, you do the equivalent of plain geometry proofs. There are specific pieces of chess for which that approach works. If you have certain positions, you can count the tempi and guarantee this pawn is going to get pushed to the 8th row, or this game is a stalemate, choose one. However, so puzzle is a little more dangerous than it can be made to sound. Of course, jigsaw puzzle, there's no choice exactly. Well, you can choose to start in different parts of the board. The goal is preset. There's only one outcome, assuming you can solve the puzzle. That's less true of 19th century jigsaw puzzles, where the pieces did not interdigitate, they did not have color overlap, you did not get a photograph or image of what it was you were trying to make, and then life could be a little more challenging. Okay, so we've sort of said some things that games are not. I suppose we could say on this last one, though, they're not toys, they're not stories, they're not things with no or almost no participation, and they're not puzzles. On the other side, there are things that games should have if they're games. And Kostikian mostly gives a good list of these. There are some things that could be added. What could we add? Well, first I'm going to put in a bifurcation. Game, simulation. There are vast numbers of board war games in the world. Well, I own 4,500 and my collection is by no means complete. And many of them, most of them, are played by one person, not by two people. They're being played because they recreate a historical event, and they either let you see the historical event or study what would have happened if you tried alternative moves. Now, some games are much better at this than others. Others games were not designed to be simulations, and so if you try to duplicate the combat events on the game board, you will be severely disappointed. However, there was a huge market for things which really were called simulations, and they have rules that make them a game, but you should realize that the audience that is paying you money for the games may have other uses for them. This is one of the reasons why simulations publications for a long time was quite successful. Namely, they actually did consumer studies to determine what was going on, and they learned things. Okay, so what do we have in a game? Well, we have goals. You have some objective in mind. The opposite of goal is toy. Now, that sounds sort of simple, doesn't it? You play with a toy, but you don't have a competition over a toy other than, that's my game, toy ship, give it back to me, slug, slug. Well, on the other hand, I can point at something, original Dungeons and Dragons, there were a set of rules, but in a fundamental sense, it was a toy, not a game, because the players got to choose their own objectives, which could be setting up merchant kingdoms, wandering around the wilderness until you ran into that most deadly of all opponents, a small group of men. You get the general idea. So there's sort of a line there, but yeah, in general, they're goals. Then, there's decision making. That is, if you were saying we are trying to get from point A to point B, the player has to have some input in how you do this. If you have a game in which the games master always simply says, you know that won't work, and you simply have to guess what you are supposed to do, there's not much of a game there. The low form of that is the old computer games where the computer had a very limited vocabulary, and you had to type in the right words for things to happen. Well, that's fine if you can guess the words. On the other hand, here we are in the second floor where this would actually work safely. The building is on fire. It is wood frame. And to get out, you have to jump out the window because the firemen have a net waiting for you. And you try jump out window, jump, open window, but you can spend a lot of time typing until you hit the magic phrase, defenestrate character. And you should realize that your chances of guessing that are fairly poor unless the game is in basic and you can read naive code. So this is, at some point, if there's no decision making, there's not much of a game there. Now is there? Okay, so there's decision making. Then next in line down the row are resources. And since you've now played Puerto Rico, Carcassonne has Meeple, of course. You've played Vanished Planet, and most of you have played other games, though not all of you. You've seen resources in action. Resources are a large part of the things you make decisions about. They're not the only things that you make decisions about, because another part of games, an optional part, is interaction. That is, if you have two players, you can attempt to interact with the other player. If it's a two-player War to the Death game, there are not many options. If it's Dungeons and Dragons, well, in some campaigns, the player interaction is everything, and every so often, okay, it's a combat event. Do we actually want to fight this out, or can I just roll a die and tell you how many hit points you took before you wiped out the cloud of monsters? Some people are much more interested in some things and less in others. However, resources, things that you can choose. Now, resources are of different sorts. And one specific mechanism which actually introduces resources are limited actions. The chess example is you may only move one piece, and then it's the other guy's turn. There are also resources that are more identifiable as natural resources. Barrels of sugar, lumber, tanks that must be assigned to tank divisions, spaceships. There are things you get to deploy. Well, there are goals, there's decision making, but in many cases there is resistance to getting to the goals in the form of opposition. Opposition can actually be opponents. You're moving the black chess pieces, the other fellow is moving the white chess pieces, you are up against each other, and you are trying to get an advantage. Chess has the feature, this was not picked up on entirely optimally in one of the homework problems, that if you manage to get a significant advantage like a piece, and both players are even moderately competent, unless there is something very strange on the other side, like mate and two, the piece advantage is totally overwhelming. And simple strategies like trade off other pieces until there's nothing left on the board, but you still have your piece advantage, will usually win for you. However, there is opposition. Now, opposition does not have to be a human player. In Vanished Planet, opposition was the giant starfish reaching out from the planet Earth, but was it intelligent? Was it alive? Was it a natural phenomenon? That really wasn't central, and it always did exactly the same thing. Every chance it got, it shoved its tentacle out another hex towards the people it wanted to eat, or whatever. So that is opposition. Then, of course, there are tokens. Now, I'm going to parenthesize that Kostikian treats tokens as something you have to have a game. On the other hand, those of you familiar with chess may be aware of blind chess. We will play chess. This means that with the features on that board, this means the two of us will stand there and call out moves to each other. Pawn to h4, pawn to a4, rook to a3, rook to h3. Some of you may recognize the opening I'm using. And the person on the other side is calling out things in the opposite direction. But there's no board. In fact, instead, both players are keeping everything in their memory. The tokens are a memory tool. I guess you could say collectible card games are an exception to that. In collectible card games, the right to have a Dragon Slayer spell card means that you somehow went through the process of procuring one, and you can only use that particular card if you actually have it. And in that case, the tokens mean that you have gone through the collection process or the store robbery process. This is not an approved approach. Or the, I actually do have a printer good enough to fake those cards now, don't I? And I have the right card stock, don't I? Well, in any event, there are a variety of schemes for doing this, which people have been known to use, but the token actually means something because there was something outside the game you had to do to get it. In normal games, as opposed to Money the Gathering, in normal games there are no such features, and the tokens are memory items. Question?
Well, in any case where the token is here by randomness in the game, you can't fully do that through memory. You'll need some sort of tool to help you randomly generate which one you would
Well, yes. I mean, you could say we are going to draw an event card, and the event cards are face down. However, in any case where the outcome is I am going to draw an event card, it could instead be there is a table of the 400 event cards, and I have broken out my D10s and D4s, and I will roll a random number, and I will get an event card. And because I will get an event card, except it's just an event, and now I have substituted for the event card an alternative random process.
I know you could
Most people in their right mind would not do this. Yes? Question?
I was just saying, I know you need something to, you could do it some other random way. I was just saying you couldn't do it fully in your mind.
Well, saying you're doing it in your mind doesn't mean there can't also be random numbers. There used to be a small number of people who could play at least the opening moves of Avalon Hill Stalingrad, which is one of these hex and counter board games with about 100 units, without bothering to set it up, because they could see what was going on clearly enough. There are all sorts of interesting people out there. However, accepting these little details, tokens are the things that help you remember what's going on. They have another purpose, but it's not central to this is a game. Oh yes. Rules. In the end, if there is going to be competition, you have to have agreement as to what is going on and how the back and forth will be settled. If you don't have agreement on what the rules are or what the rules mean, you run into all sorts of difficulties. Miniatures games where we don't have hexes, we just have free terrain and you measure distances in inches or whatever. Miniatures games tend to be somewhat sensitive to rules disputes, especially if the rules are not well written. For example, if the rules say, well, I have a cardboard tag, it's called a stand, and there are toy soldiers on it seen from above. And if the two tags are facing each other, going in opposite direction, that's a frontal attack. However, if one of the tags is to the side by more than 50% with respect to the other, this is now a flank attack. Well, is it 50% or is it not 50%? And settling whether it is 50% or not, that's rather sensitive. There are a variety of more of these. People who are designing simulations don't worry about this as much because the simulations played for simulations, they're not games because they do not have opposition. To put it another way, they do not have competition. Kostikian completely deprecates the notion of cooperative games, games in which everyone is on the same side. Now, there were a great number of cooperative games that have been developed at different times which live up to this, that is, nothing interesting is happening. There were also cooperative games like Vanished Planet, in which it is everyone on one side and it, the unseen stalking horror, on the other side. Many role-playing games are this way too, that is, everyone in the game is playing more or less on the same side, as opposed to we are going to have an open field battle between law and chaos and everyone has showed up with their army. Part of the reason for why don't we do this other version? And the answer is one of the things that interests people and attracts them to the game and gets them to commit to the game is what we would call investment. Now, investment can mean that you have sunk a ton of cash into it, like some of these very formal miniatures rules games. Investment can mean you did buy 100,000 cards to get exactly the cards you wanted for your strategy. But investment can also be emotional and imaginational. That is, you have your D&D character or your champion's character that you have been playing for several years, and you have worked out its personality, etc., in great detail. And having a games master arbitrarily destroy it is viewed somewhat dimly. Having the games master grab the character sheet because the character died and tear the character sheet up. I have seen this done. It didn't quite lead to physical violence because we could reassemble the sheet. Well, you know, that's investment, and that tends to push everyone on the same side because if you are at opposite sides and you wipe each other's characters out, this will have interactions on the player level. Okay, so there's interaction and competition. There are tokens I mentioned. There have to be rules to settle what's going on. Now, you might say, well, some games have very simple rules, some are much more complicated. I have mentioned Advanced Squad Leader with the 140-some pages opening, not to mention everything else, and you can name some other games that are like that. There are, of course, games that look very simple, like Go. Go, as played in many countries, has fairly simple rules. There is a counting rule, that is, exactly what do you count to determine who won and who lost, and what is added and what is subtracted. And there are some small, or used to be, some small national differences, I guess is a polite word there. On the other hand, at least in one country, if you have a formation at the end of the game that may or may not be dead or alive, you don't play it out. Instead, you consult two extremely thick manuals full of closing positions which rule on whether a position is dead or alive or not. In at least one case, computer analysis proved that the assertion that a certain position was dead was mistaken. It was quite alive if you knew what to do. But that sort of thing is, nonetheless, you need to have rules. Oh yes, related to tokens, which are a way of recording things, we could say information. Information is what you use to do the decision making. If you have no information, decisions are very hard to make. What counts as information is not necessarily the same as what is being recorded by the tokens. A traditional example is poker. If you write a poker playing program that always looks at exactly what people have done and does numerical simulation as to whether it should continue to play or quit, it will with great regularity lose. It will with great regularity lose because it won't have, in the traditional example, it would fail to handle bluffing correctly. If you are playing with a group of people with whom you have played on a regular basis, that's often the case, or where you can study the plays that they have made in the past, you have information that is not in the game. It's meta information about what is in their heads. This is why, when I was back at Michigan once upon a time, with a certain regularity it was discovered there were people in apartments overlooking one football field or another, running the video cameras while the other team was practicing their secret plays. This was a practice was deprecated by the authorities, which is why on occasion people actually got caught and did not complain when several grand video equipment was worked over with sledgehammer or whatever. In any event, there were things like that went on that certain schools were accused of doing undoubtedly falsely. We have no idea how their assistant coaches got into that apartment or what the video equipment was actually being used for. In any event, having said this, those are sort of the things that you do have in games. There are also things that are not central to this is a game, which add to the game. What sort of things add to a game? Theme, which leads to color. Color includes the game box, the pretty illustrations in the rules. If you want to work at it, the illustrations aren't just this is playing counter number 1, this is playing counter number 2. But if you look at all of the borders, someone has spent time inserting artwork, and it's like one of those old-fashioned children's books in which you have these marvelous illustrations and a small number of words interspersed. That's color and theme. That's something that attracts people. Sort of down here someplace, role-playing, player interaction, on one hand, you can have information and player interaction, and that's part of one of the things that makes it a game. On the other hand, you can enhance the role-playing elements and player interaction elements, and it attracts people even if there's no game there at the moment. Some of these very large Society for Creative Anachronism events, yes, they do have the infantry battles that do involve more people than most medieval infantry battles do. But there are also all of the people who are doing medieval cooking and medieval court practice and medieval dancing, and there's a real long list of these things. And it's role-playing. And it actually has nothing to do with any competition. But it's role-playing. I mentioned themes. Another thing you can do is you can actually generate sorts of games in which the lure of the game is very heavily based on the tokens. And one example, which I've already talked about, are block-style games in which you have wooden blocks that are propped up on their side. And the wooden blocks mean each side cannot tell which of those blocks is the big army and which of those blocks is a bluff, and cannot easily tell which of those armies is at full strength and which of those armies has been greatly weakened, and the blocks store the information. There was also a whole series of games under the joint name Cliques. It was a stand. It held it doesn't have to be a toy soldier. It could have been a toy baseball player on top. However, you could rotate the base with respect to the character, and there was then data stored as a result. A significant part of the lure of the games was, gee, it makes this interesting noise, and there's data storage. Collectability. 1950s baseball cards. Collectible, they were collectible then, they're even more collectible now. However, on many of the 50s baseball cards, there was in fact a game there. I am old enough to remember people collecting them in the 50s. I never remember anyone even mentioning there was a game involved, and I wasn't interested in enough to look at these things. But there were games. Okay. Cards. And on one hand, you can say, yes, the card represents things. On the other hand, if the cards were little squares of cardboard that simply had the name of the spell and the number of hit points it did, that's much less impressive than the elaborately illustrated, elaborately calligraphed, etc. sort of card you see in some games. And the calligraphy and the artwork and the prettiness is part of what you're selling. Okay, are we on? Oh, we're getting almost to the end. So we've talked about themes. You can, of course, do more elaborate items. There have been games in which there would be large plastic tower in the center. This was the tower, Citadel of Evil, and it had all sorts of electronic flashing lights and noises and other things, and sensed where your unit counters were with respect to it. About 20 years ago, there was a World War III game which came with around 100 plaster of Paris mushroom clouds, all carefully, lovingly painted to look like hydrogen bomb explosions. The game cost a mint back then because it was heavy-hand production work. I have not seen one for sale in a long time. If you ever see one and the price looks low, grab it. It's worth a lot of money. Okay. So we have added a number of things that attract the game but aren't exactly part of the game. Someplace in the middle, Kostikian talks about tension. His idea of tension is somewhat focused on computer games where each opponent is larger than the last until the very end of the game. We may contrast this with literary tension. Some fraction of you have read Lord of the Rings. Yes, hands. Okay, many of you have read it. And you may recall there is the huge battle, and there is the ring going down the drain. And then there are a fair number of chapters, and Tolkien wrote a considerable number of others that aren't there, where, dear, I'm home. Oh, the villains have showed up in the Shire. We're going to have a battle which would be unnoticeably small by contrast with the battles that have already been fought, but it's an important literary element. In one of the things that Tolkien, I don't know this is how generally known this is, or whether it's in one of the extra books. Eowyn indeed does marry the young man. Tolkien hated that character because she had misbehaved so badly. Instead of staying on the throne and protecting her people, she had gone off and did all of the things she did, like killing the Lord Witch King. And as a result, he connives to have her die of childbirth fever soon after she marries. This is not quite what many people would have expected to happen. Some people did not get to live happily or very much thereafter. However, the literary things, yes, you have the big battles, and then you have the cleanup, and you have events that are promised that are happy events, and so the tension at the end just ebbs away like the receding tide. Kostikian, however, is right. If there's no tension, like invasion of Luxembourg 1940, where one side actually did not have armed forces in a normal sense, well, if there's no tension, why is it of any interest? It could be of interest, but you have to be clever to make it interesting. I have run us out of time. Class is dismissed.